You're watching Canadian Muslim news on Muslim Network TV from Toronto, Ontario. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. I'm Catherine Bullock. Today we'll be talking to Bayan Khatib from the Syrian Canadian Foundation about how she's been helping settle Syrian immigrants in Canada. But first, some news headlines. Federal government pledges up to $40 billion for First Nations children. Lack of diversity in Western University's new Law Council. Brampton man charged with 11 counts of mischief for hate-motivated graffiti. And New Zealand Prime Minister honours Muslim men for their bravery. And now the details. The federal government is promising around $40 billion to compensate First Nations children and reform the child welfare system. Ministers Mark Miller and Patty Hadju announced the decision earlier this week and said that more details will be provided at the end of the month. The pledge comes after a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found the government guilty of discriminating against First Nations children on reserves and ordered them to pay up to $40,000 to each victim. National Chief Roseanne Archibald told APTN that while money does not mean justice, it does signal the path towards healing and reform. Western University's new Law Council is being met with backlash after it featured almost all white members. Their Faculty of Law revealed the 12 advisory members last month. They say that the members were chosen for their diverse networks and are to improve the university's reputation and educational services. Since then, people have taken to Twitter to express their concerns over the lack of diversity on the panel. Omar Haradai, a 2010 Western Law graduate, told CBC News that Indigenous and racialized lawyers lack the family connections and network to access jobs and opportunities in the legal field, serving as a barrier for diversity and representation. A man was arrested and charged with almost a dozen counts of mischief for drawing hate-motivated graffiti around the city of Brampton in Ontario. 32-year-old Kartik Tugnate was charged with 11 counts of mischief over $5,000 for scrawling graffiti over bus shelters, buildings, and vehicles containing racial remarks and offensive images. Tugnate was released on the condition that he will appear in court in February. Following a similar incident earlier this month, Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown said that hate has no place in Brampton and that there will be zero tolerance for hate crimes. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, awarded 10 people the prestigious Bravery Honour Award, including 2 Muslim men. The award was given to Dr. Naeem Rashid posthumously and Abdulaziz, both of whom risked their lives to stop a gunman from killing worshippers in 2 Christchurch's mosques in 2019. Rashid was killed by the gunman after tackling him, and Aziz chased the shooter when he tried to escape the scene. Established in 1999, the award has only been given to 2 individuals prior to today. A ceremony to honour the recipients will be held early next year. That's it for the news, and now our conversation with Bayan Khatib of the Canadian Syrian Foundation. In the year 2000, the United Nations declared December 18th would be the International Migrants' Day, which is coming up this Saturday. We thought we'd focus on the Syrian population in Canada. Since 2015, the Syrian refugees have been the largest refugee crisis of our times, and Canada stepped up by bringing in 25,000, I believe, refugees in a very short time in 2015, 2016. Today we have on the show someone who is involved with the Syrian Canadian Foundation. I think I misspoke it before when I introduced you. I said Canadian Syrian Foundation, the executive director, and I mispronounced that too instead of just being a member of the board. We welcome you, Bayan Khatib, to the show.
Thank you, Kathy.
I just mentioned about the Canadian government stepping up to the plate. It's hard to believe that it's already 6 years ago. It just feels like, a few days ago. When your organization works with the refugees coming in from Syria, what is the first priority that you try to help them with?
So the Syrian Canadian Foundation started about 6 years ago when the Syrians first started to arrive in Canada. And the needs at that time were really urgent needs. So there was housing, of course, connecting them to housing, dealing with very urgent medical needs. A lot of these people were arriving from refugee camps where they haven't had their medical needs looked after for a long time. And then after that, of course, it's like connecting to English classes, getting their kids registered in schools, providing them with an orientation of their neighborhoods and the resources available in Canada. After that comes trying to find meaningful employment, which is a very big struggle, of course, for refugees, especially a lot of them coming here without their credentials or their papers that they need.
And is that stream sort of over now, that urgent situation of arriving in that state?
So for the Syrian refugees, yes, there are still some who are trickling in now. So back then, the government had committed to bringing 25,000, as you said, Kathy. But I think up to this point, that number has, gotten certainly over 60,000 Syrian refugees in Canada now. Last I checked, which was a while back. So there are still some people who are coming in. At that time, it was the government-sponsored refugees. Now there's a lot of people coming through the private sponsorship program. And each of them has, at each different stages in their arrival, there are different needs. So the ones that arrived 5 years ago or so are have very different needs than when they first got here.
I remember, I think this was during Donald Trump's time in the US, and I don't think this happened in Canada, but maybe it did. And there was that big ad about the Skittles, the Syrian refugees, like the Skittles, and pick one and you could be picking out a terrorist. Did we have those kinds of, backlash against the Syrian refugees coming in, that they might be ISIS or something in Canada?
I would say lucky for us, that it was the Liberal government who was in power when and it was the Liberal government who decided to bring the Syrian refugees, and so there wasn't that kind of racism. If it was a different government, it very well may have looked like that. And before the Liberals took over, the Harper government was talking about doing things very differently and picking which refugees come here. But we know how dangerous that is when we're dealing with a humanitarian crisis. So I think that because the Liberal government was in power, I think it was done in a very equitable way, where families that were really vulnerable and in most need were the ones who were chosen to come.
And so you mentioned that they were coming in from refugee camps. They hadn't had a proper medical checkup. There was sort of like that urgent need trauma situation. Has dealing with the emotional fallout of having gone through that experience been a big part of what you did in the beginning, or even now? Like, does it still spill over till now times?
Sorry, do you mean for the refugees or?
Yes, the Syrian refugees.
Yeah, so when people first arrive, they are dealing with those urgent situations. They're also coming from like survival mode, right? By the time they get to Canada, they have already been through dangerous, life-risking journeys, and they get here and they have to deal with other urgent things like their medical care and housing. And then after that, what I find is there's this like big exhale and there's this like gratitude for being in safety. But at the same time, people suddenly fall into a lot of depression and mental health issues, because now they are no longer scared for their lives, but all of a sudden, depression hits hard and PTSD. And so mental health becomes a very big issue. And there's a lot of problems in dealing with that.
Right. I mean, even for people who came as migrants, I mean, that sense of homesickness. I remember reading the story of a lady who said she missed the smell of the earth, and it created such a longing in her heart. Do you have special programs that try to address those mental health aspects?
We do. We have a women's wellness program that's very much centered around mental health. And when you're dealing with people from Syria, and I'm sure other countries, you have to address mental health in a very culturally specific way, culturally customized. There's a lot of stigma on mental health. People are scared. I've met refugees that were scared to talk to a therapist because they were scared that they would take their kids away if they had identified them as mentally ill or something like that. People were, there's all sorts of fears and stigma, and that's part of the problem and part of what we try to address.
So has there been a good support network for the refugees when they first arrived, and now you mentioned that sometime later those urgent needs are over and the needs are different? Is there a good support network you're finding?
Unfortunately, no. One of the biggest problems, there's two major problems. One is the language barrier. A lot of these families arrive with zero or little English. And when you're getting mental health services, you really need to do it in your first language. And there just weren't enough Arabic speaking mental health providers. Second of all, seeing a therapist or a psychologist in Canada is not free, and it is very, very expensive. There are very few programs here and there that have some free services, but it is something that the government has not prioritized as an essential, health need for people. And I don't think that makes any sense, because if you don't support people's mental health, they are not going to integrate well. They are not going to become contributing members of the community. They are not going to get meaningful employment and contribute back to Canada, which is what they want to do. But if we neglect mental health and kind of label it as non-essential, then we're really not doing a favor to refugees or to the country.
There were a lot of generous Canadians in churches and nonprofit organisations who sponsored a family or two. How was it then for the refugee family arriving if they couldn't speak English?
Yeah, it was absolutely beautiful. The Canadian response to the Syrian refugee crisis, how private sponsor groups came together from all over the country, all sorts of people, whether it was churches or mosques or book clubs or, all sorts of things. And so dealing with the language barrier was very interesting. Oftentimes, sorry?
No, I didn't say anything. Keep
going. I think a lot of times they look to volunteers from the community who spoke Arabic to come in and translate. So I remember that my Arabic isn't perfect, but I did a lot of volunteer translation where I, got pulled into different, even just social gatherings where a private sponsor would want to communicate with the family that they brought here, and I would help them do that. So it was just a lot of volunteerism.
You mentioned that the Syrians who are arriving, they want to get on their feet as fast as possible and contribute. We're almost out of time, but would you like to share a success story?
One of my favorite success stories is a young woman. Her name is Hanan Nana, who came here as a refugee. I met her at the Toronto Plaza Hotel, which was the temporary housing of the Syrians when they arrived here. And she went on to create her own youth-led organization called BAM, Books, Art, and Music, bringing together youth from different backgrounds to support each other and to do really great work. She's also very active in the community on so many fronts. She also worked with us at the Syrian Canadian Foundation, and she just exemplified, really taking the opportunities that Canada gave her and doing something great with them, and just being such an amazing giving back. And she always volunteers with other newcomers who are coming here as well, which is part of the giving back. And right now they're actually launching a Syrians for Afghans campaign at the Syrian Canadian Foundation, and Hanan is part of that. And it's just a wonderful way to give back and to show gratitude for the wonderful Canadian response.
It's a very warm, what a lovely story to end what's been a harrowing journey for most people. Thank you for coming on the show and sharing with us.
Thank you, Kathy.
You've been watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe and God bless.